In this episode, I want to show you a gem called Decent Exposure. Now this is a really simple gem, but it has a neat concept, and that is instead of defining instance variables in your controller for your views to use, instead you define an interface of methods for your view to access in your controller. And in the gem, it uses this method called expose for defining the interface. Before I dive into this gem though, first in this episode I want to show you how you can apply this concept into a controller manually, and then we'll look into adding the gem itself. Now this is the application we'll be working with in this episode. It's a simple blogging application with many articles, and each article can have many comments. It's a pretty basic blogging app here. And the controller is pretty standard as well. In the index action here, we're just assigning an instance variable called articles, and then in the view layer, we're using that instance variable right here. Now, I don't know about you, but when I first came to Rails, I thought it was a little strange that we're sharing access to instance variables because those are usually pretty private, and the view layer is not executed in the same context as the controller. So we're sharing instance variables, but not all the methods and so on. That seemed a little strange to me. I don't have as much of a problem with it now, but here let me show you an alternative way to do it, where we expose methods instead of using instance variables to share data. So to accomplish this manually without the use of any gems, we could just extract this bit of code and then move it down here into a private method. It's private, so it's not considered a controller action, and we'll call it articles, and then just paste that code into there. Now this time, however, I want the articles instance variable just to be used as a cache, so that the articles are only fetched one time here. I won't be referencing the instance variable anywhere else through the controllers or views. So to expose this method to the views, I just need to make it a helper method called articles, and then I can use it inside the view layer here instead of using the instance variable. So now it'll just reference the articles method directly, which calls the same thing instead of using instance variables in the controller. Now what about all these other member actions? Well, we can do the same thing here as well by just creating a new method here called article instead of articles, a singular version. And then we want to do a little bit of logic here because it depends if the ID parameter exists. If it does, then we want to actually find an article based off of that ID parameter. Otherwise, we're just going to create a new article based off the article parameters. And this is really nice because now we have this article method which we can use everywhere instead of the article instance variable, and we can remove the first line in each of these controller actions. So just take out the first line here in each of these. I'll just do the rest off camera. And there we go. This is what the updated controller looks like. It's pretty nice because a lot of these actions don't even have any content because they don't really have any behavior. They were just defining instance variables for the view to use, but now these are available as methods. Slims it down quite a lot. But don't stop there because we still need to go into each view and remove the instance variables and use the method call instead. So this is pretty nice because we're no longer messing with the controller's instance variables. We're just using the exposed method interface that the controller gives us. Now I'll do the other views off camera, but you get the idea. Now another benefit of this approach is that it's complete lazy loading. So for example, if we do some kind of action caching on this show action here, well, it's only going to fetch the article if we actually render the view because it's not needing the article in the controller layer. So action caching would work great here because it won't actually fetch the article unless it truly needs it. So this is a pretty nice solution, but it would be even better if there was a more convenient way to define these methods here that we're exposing to the view. And that's where the Decent Exposure gem comes into play. Now Decent Exposure provides this method called expose, which does all that we need that we did earlier. Basically, it defines a method and makes it available to the view. It has some other handy defaults as well, such as trying to fetch the model using the ID parameters. If those aren't available, it'll just build a model using those parameters. So it's really great. You can leave it at its defaults for handling member type actions. And any other kind of behavior, you can just pass a block to it and handle any other kind of custom behavior you want, and it'll do all the caching and stuff automatically for you. Let's give it a try. The first step is to go to the gem file and add the decent exposure gem here. And then just run the bundle command to get that installed. And then inside our controller, we don't have to do all this rigmarole for defining methods. We can just call expose and then pass in the name. In this case, we can say article. And because it has some handy defaults for the member type behavior where it fetches it with the ID parameter or builds a new one, we can just leave those at the defaults. For the other articles method, we can just pass in a block here and then just pass in our custom behavior into this block, and it will work just like we do here. And we can just move these to the top of our controller because that's a nice convention, just like that. Much cleaner. And check that out. If we reload our application here, everything still works. And our controllers are just quite a bit slimmer and keeping all the same behavior and using methods now instead of instance variables. Pretty nice. Now what if we add nested resources though, like this? You can see here in our routes file we have our resources articles, and then nested in here we have resources comments. Let me show you the comments controller. And so here's what that controller looks like. As you can see, we're still using our instance variables here, and notice we're having to fetch the article at the top of each action here because it's a nested resource, and then we're either fetching the comments or building the comments through that article. Now we can use decent exposure here, and it has full support for nested resources. So all we have to do is call expose for each of these instance variables. So we have our expose our article, and then default behavior here will just work since we're just fetching a single member here with the article ID. And then we can all expose our comments. And for this one, we'll need some custom behavior since it's a many comments here. We'll just fetch our article comments because that's using our article resource up here. And we can expose our comment. We can leave that at its defaults as well, since it'll just build one for each of these actions since they don't have an ID parameter. And for this, because we're already assigning all the data here, all we have to do is delete all these lines which have we're assigning instance variables to. And then instead of referencing the instance variables, we just reference the method calls. Very simple, cleans up the controller quite a bit. And don't forget to update the view as well. Wherever you're referencing those instance variables, just use the method calls, just like that. So now we can try out our application, and everything still works great. And our controllers are all much slimmer thanks to decent exposure. Let's try creating a comment, and that works. Go to our comments, and there we go. Looks great. Now there's one potential gotcha with decent exposure that you should be aware of, and that is if you use a default behavior like I'm doing here where I'm not passing any block to this expose method, what it's going to do is look for a pluralized version of this name, so in this case articles, and it's going to attempt to build and fetch records through that scope if a scope is available. So in this case, it's only going to build and fetch records through this article scope. So if I say where visible is true, then it's only going to find visible records when I call article on the member actions, and it's going to build them through the scope as well. Now if you don't want this behavior, the best approach is to make this pluralized version just give it a more descriptive name, such as visible articles. That way it's not considered the base default scope that other member actions are built upon. And of course, if you make a change like this, you want to be sure to change the view as well to call the visible articles method instead of just articles. But leaving it as just articles might be the behavior you want to always build and fetch things through that scope. Now, if you ever want to change the default behavior of this expose method, you can make a call to default exposure, and whatever you do inside the block you pass into it will override the default behavior of the expose method. And the argument name you pass into expose will be passed into the block here as well. Now, I don't think you normally need to do this, but the option's there if you want to. Well, that wraps up this episode and our look into the decent exposure gem. I think it's pretty neat. I don't really know if I would use it in my everyday development yet. I would just need to do some experimenting, and I encourage you to do the same and see if it really fits your workflow and cleans up your code.